and welcome to episode 3 of the lecture on global change. Professor Lopez has already given us 2 episodes on the topics of global change and planetary boundaries, and we will now take some time to talk things over. Maybe I can ask some questions that you would have too. So, Professor Lopez, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will start just like you started in episode number 1 and ask for the 4 spikes. You said that it was the CO2 pollution, it was extinction, it was consumption, and it was a problem of human population. Is there anything that is maybe more dangerous than another, or are they all the same?
That's a very good question. I would say that they are equally important, the 4 of them, but that human population, in my perspective, is the one that accelerates the other 3. So it's because of the increase in human population and level of consumerism that we have raised the level of CO2 in the atmosphere as a result of our industrial countries, and also the power to use to produce, to generate food and consume, and water, need for water and energy and other resources have impacted the natural environment, the ecosystems, in unprecedented ways through habitat destruction, which leads to species extinction. So I would say, in summary, I think is the 4 together which are interconnected that is the great danger. But if there is one driver, in my perspective, that driver would be human population.
Okay, but human population, when I think about rising population and, no, not rising, but increasing, that's the word I was looking for, increasing human population. Well, actually, the increase in human population was largely influenced or made possible through better medical care. So if you, well, I think that, or when I listen to you, I think that actually more population makes things worse. So how could a decline in population happen? Do you actually want a pandemic, or what do you think should happen?
That is a very difficult question because from my perspective, from an ecological perspective, the planet cannot support large population. This is an ecological principle. As the number of species increase dramatically, it exceeds the capacity of the environment to maintain that species. And ecologically, species tend to flourish when the environment in which they emerge is healthy. Okay, so the problem here is the increase in human population accelerates environmental degradation, exacerbates environmental degradation. And I'm concerned about some type of feedback that can affect human population dramatically. I don't know how we could reduce human population, and I hope that before something more serious, like you said, an epidemic comes, that we humans will find a way to bring this to a lower level. Maybe the governments start providing incentives to families and educating them about having smaller children. Of course, you notice from the slide that the greatest expansion in population actually is not taking place into the developed world, but in the undeveloped world. There is where there is so much uncertainty. They don't have health insurance. Therefore, the insurance of the family is to be guaranteed to the children. They at least hope so. And also there is high level of mortality. So to make sure that an old couple would have some children to take care of them, they try to have 10, 15, maybe perhaps 5 of them will survive. So I hope that we're going to find out a way to bring population down. to levels that are ecologically acceptable. But of course, when we do this, we are faced with and have to deal with issues of equity, and also something that I didn't mention in the lecture is issues of poverty and social injustice. So we cannot allow population levels in the developed world and try to exterminate or reduce population in the less developed world. Of course, it's difficult to talk about an epidemics, but from an ecology perspective, that is always possible, because some type of viruses and bacteria and some things that may not be welcomed by the human species can just emerge out of a degraded environment. I don't know when, why, where, but it's possible. So this is certainly something that we have to worry about. As the environment degrades, the possibility that the degraded conditions, from out of the degraded conditions, something less favorable to humanity could emerge, and that could destroy part of us.
Mm-hmm. So when I think about, well, diseases, for example, I get back to that medical care thought, because I just thought, could it be that social improvements contributed to more environmental degradation? Isn't that
social improvement? You say again?
Yeah, like for example, better medical care, or what you also said, the purchasing power of people rises. You said that in episode 1.
Right.
That's actually in the first second. I thought, well, that's a good information.
Yes.
That's something good that happened. However, environmental damages are increasing.
Right. That's a very good question. Because when we talk about development, human development, I am not saying that everything that comes from human progress is bad. I'm not saying that. Of course, for example, the advancements in science and medicine has done greatly. We know more about health issues today than that we knew before. But unfortunately, there are other aspects, I would say a dark aspect of this development that is detrimental to us. So it's almost like as we develop, out of this development emerge things that are favorable to the human species. But unfortunately, there are also things that are detrimental. For example, I will look at medicine, advancement in medicine, as something highly beneficial coming out of advancement in science and society. But I see the development of corporations, the widespread of capitalism and consumerism as one bad aspect of population. So I think what we have to do is go to what I mentioned in the first lecture, to this paradigm shift in which we continue to develop, but focus more on the positive aspect of this development and try as much as possible to minimize the negative effects.
There are actually a lot of negative effects, which you pointed out today. It was actually 2 episodes with many information. You then, in episode 2, spoke about the planetary boundaries. Do you think that before the thoughts on global change and planetary boundaries arose, people weren't at all aware that what they do might negatively affect their environment? Or was there actually no need?
Well, I think starting in the 60s, with, for example, the United States was Rachel Carson, I think Western society, and by extension the world, became more and more aware of the human impacts upon the environment. But there has been always a difficult to measure or assess those impacts at the global level, because as you know, we deal here with a very complex system with the scales issues, and extremely difficult. So I would say that before the planetary boundaries, we have had many efforts. People have tried to make estimates, obviously with great level of uncertainty, about possible impacts of human agency on a global scale. I think a good thing that planetary boundary bring us is the fact that they use the biophysical, geobiophysical fundamental concepts of the Earth planet. and use that as indicators, can be used as indicators and guidelines to drive our direction, our interventions and our actions towards the environment. Of course, I mentioned here levels of tolerance and the proposed boundaries, but there are obviously some uncertainty about those boundaries. And at the end, which I hope is that those boundaries will be established themselves through some type of social agreement, which will depend, for example, how much risk are we willing to take, because there is always an uncertainty involved in transgressing those boundaries. So of course, if we talk to a society who is trying not to take too much risk, so they will move that boundary closer and closer. Or if we are in a situation that the society is willing to take more risk, so we're going to move that boundary farther and farther. But that is not a number, a quantity that should be taken as a certainty, but possible an indicator that most of all has to be achieved through some type of social agreement.
So why did you focus on the planetary boundaries? There have been several attempts to, or several approaches to global changes. Why is it the planetary boundaries that are relevant for the understanding of global change?
Very good. The reason why I focused on planetary boundaries, because first is emerging concept, so it's something new, and grew out of this interdisciplinary group of scientists who came together, try to develop some type of framework that could be used practically, that could use as guidelines for policy making, decision making, management. And secondly, although there has been many attempts in the past to come out with indicators to assess the state of the planet, none of them were as comprehensive as the planetary boundaries. So planetary boundaries is still in a very early stage. So I don't think that we know much about it. There is still much uncertainty about the use of this approach. But I believe as research continues in that direction, we're going to learn more and more. And I see the planetary boundaries as having tremendous potential to help us to move in the right direction.
Do you think there's any chance that the social impacts might be included someday?
That is a need, because as I mentioned in the lecture, the scientists who developed the planetary boundary concept, they pretty much focused on the geobiophysical aspects and then didn't focus on the social. But your question is very important, because I will give you two scenarios here, possible scenarios. They are social scenarios, very different from each other, that can reach the same goal. Suppose that we have two societies, and both societies wants to operate within the safe boundaries as proposed by the planetary boundary approach. But one society is what I call a fortress society. It's a military society, very elitist, with tremendous concentrated power. And let's suppose that the majority of that society live in poverty, undesirable condition, which is pretty much the state of the world at the moment. So because of the power in the hands of that group, they would establish laws and force the operation within the planetary boundaries. But as long as they would not address the social issues, the poverty, the inequality, so they would operate within safe boundaries but would not solve the inequity issue. So on the other hand, we have a more equity, a more socially distributed society in which they seek, first of all, the well-being of all. So that society still could establish laws and approaches to operate within the planetary boundaries, but the result would be different. That they operate within the planetary boundaries would bring benefit to the entire society, as opposed to the first group who would benefit, still continue benefit a specific group. So in this class, I told about in the beginning the need for a paradigm shift, and I'll continue talking about the paradigm shift. And the other subjects that we'll be discussing in the coming lectures, will be always, when talking about them, be confronted with this paradigm shift. And here's again, based on the example I just gave you, another clear indication of the need for that shift. Because let's suppose that there is no paradigm shift, that the inequity continues as now. We have the very rich developed world, industrial world, and we have 2/3 of the world population live in complete poverty. No medical assistance, no fresh water to drink. But let's suppose that the powerful nations of the West decide in a meeting somewhere that they, from now on, will operate within the planetary boundaries. So of course, they will improve the condition of the planet, but on their own behalf. So they will guarantee that they will continue flourishing and developing and not take in consideration the poor and the rest of the world who won't benefit from this. So therefore, if the goal of the planetary boundaries is the flourishing of human society, for that flourishing to take place, operate within the planetary boundaries is a necessary condition, but not sufficient. We need to have social reforms that will allow to extend the benefits of operating within the boundaries to be distributed, expanded to all sectors of society.
But social reforms on which level?
Social reforms like, I think, if you ask this question to different people, they answer differently. So to me, as I said in the beginning of the lecture on civic ecology, I think the social reform that I'm talking about is by people become more aware of and conscient of our interconnection and the need to work and live together, because we are all interdependent. And whatever I do, I affect not just the other, but myself. So the social reform is any type of reform that would reinforce the establishment of that mentality, that notion of interdependence and working together. So how that's going to be implemented under the current conditions is a good question. As I said in the first lecture, from my perspective, playing the role where I am now as a professor, work with these young minds, is to insist again in this point again and again and again, and hope that they eventually become political leaders and get some power, and they share this thinking and start developing policies that will promote this social type of reforms we are talking about.
So these reforms actually have to grow from the, let's say, individual level and then go through society, but not be handed from above.
I think, as I said, I think in our first interview, that we act in the world according to the way we think about ourselves. And even I mentioned Gandhi here, that be the change that we want to see in the world. So right now, although it seems very unlikely that a movement coming from down, from the people, suddenly they start becoming, let's say, more conscious, more aware of environmental issues, and they start demanding more and more policies that support the environment. We may think that no, it's not going to work because the corporations, the systems in power will continue to implement. I don't believe that, because again, I think about India and I think about the extraordinary work that Gandhi did there. When he came to India, dominated by the British, he was able to work at the basic level and raise the awareness of the Indian people as a nation. And they got the British out of India in a pacific, non-violent way. So I hope that we also kind of emulate Gandhi in the West and try some type of movement looking for social reform motivated by ecological principles and social justice, and that as a community we become more and more aware. So eventually the leaders will perhaps start supporting this type of movement.
Okay. Well, I think at the moment we still have the problem that developed countries think about the impacts on the environment they produce, but there's also some developing countries who say, well, you've been doing that for years and years, and now you want to prohibit all that, and we are the ones who have to suffer. Well, I think that is quite complicated. You talked about the institutions to make sure that planetary boundaries are respected. So what kind of institutions would that be? Do we need more policies? Do we need more regularity? And is it on a national level, or would it have to be worldwide? What do you think about these institutions?
That's a very good question, also very difficult to answer. But before, before answer that question, I would like to address one point that you made, which is a point that they usually bring this into discussion, is about, you know, reaching some type of ecological balance in harmony with nature. So usually there is this thought that the rich natures continue operating, the rich nations continue operate at the level they operate now, and stop all the possibility of the poor nations to develop. So obviously I don't talk about that. My approach to the development is a socio-ecological approach. For this approach to work, what we have to do is the rich nations allow themselves to lower the level of consumption and use of the environment to allow the poor nations to raise theirs. Because again, from ecological perspective, what we want is social justice, equity within an ecological framework. So as long as we have this inequality, you know, few powerful nations in control of all the resources and energy, and the poor without any chance to develop, this is not the type of development that I envision. And here, by saying this, you see the difficulty that we are confronted with, because for this to take place, the rich nations have to come out to a conclusion that they have to give up some for the others to have something. So when this is going to happen, I see this a very difficult issue in the country where I come from, in the United States, and in many other countries. So with respect to the institution, that is a very difficult level. But again, I try to answer this from the perspective of paradigm shift. I would say that, you know, at the end of the lecture on planetary boundaries, the authors of the article suggest a possibility of an institution with global power to operate and make sure that the implementation of policies to maintain human activity within the safe boundaries will be implemented everywhere. I think if we try to implement this type of policy within the current paradigm, it's dangerous. Because within the current paradigm of this inequality and power control, the question that arises always is, okay, who decides what is better for you or for the other? So the question goes always to the end, who is making the decision? And under the current paradigm, one group is going to make that decision. Maybe UN, a group in the UN, maybe, you know, the European Union, somebody will do, and I don't think that that's what I'm talking about here. So to me, again, if you accept the notion that to be more efficient, all this change should take place under different paradigm. So I would, again, you know, think about not one institution, but emulating the notion of complex systems, a network of institutions nested within each other, okay, all exchange information and working towards the same goal. Is this possible to implement under the current paradigm? I don't think so. So it's something to think about.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question well, but the authors of the planetary boundaries suggest this global institution, but under the current paradigm, I still kind of worries me a little bit deciding about what institution is this native institution, who is part of it, and who makes the decisions. I'm afraid that at the end, you know, there will be decisions geared towards supporting the powerful and the rich and continue blocking the development of the poor.
The experts who developed these planetary boundaries, I think they were from the developed countries, weren't they?
Right. So I know, I understand the point they made, but I really would like to see in that article something that at least would say that for that to work, to have an institution with some global power, that should happen in a different context. Because in our current context, I don't know if that would be very helpful.
But these experts, how did they? Well, we already talked about that. There were several other approaches. How did they get to these planetary boundaries, and how did they choose these 9, and how did they estimate these boundaries you introduced in that table?
This is another good question, because when we deal with environmental issues, one problem that we are usually confronted with is the scale issue. So as the scale of the problem increases, the complexity of the problem increases, the uncertainty increases. So there are great difficulties to make measurements at a large scale, as opposed to measurements that we do at a small scale. Traditionally, natural sciences have developed making measurements at the low scale and then extrapolating those measurements at larger scale. But all this happened before the advent, for example, of complexity science, which brought one point that they brought is the issue of nonlinearity. So because of the issue of nonlinearity, it becomes very difficult to extrapolate measurements made at a small scale to a larger scale. And by this, what I mean is that they found out now that the drivers that control a response are scale dependent. So that means if I operate in a certain scale and I determine that the primary variable, the control variable driver that is producing that type of response, I certainly cannot affirm that that same driver will be as effective on a larger scale, because as the scale change, the drivers change. So that's very difficult. Therefore, the scientists dealing with these planetary boundaries, they were confronted with this difficulty to come out with these boundaries, with these numbers, numerical numbers, that would represent, a global level process. So I believe that most of this was done even by agreement, and this type of agreement was agreement about the scientists involved, based on the best knowledge they had, involved in the development of the boundaries, and also maybe using other methods, using other approaches like models, global change models. But again, these models are limited because most of the interaction among processes built in this model are based on our understanding of small-scale processes. That's why there is so much uncertainty about these predictions about the future, because they are all based on what we understand on a small scale and cannot be necessarily reproduced at a larger scale. But I still believe the approach is valid. So, and I think what the scientists expect is that our understanding of cross-scale processes will continue improving. In other words, that we will be able to make better estimates of those numbers, and at the same time that the society at large gets involved in the agreement of what these numbers should be.
Okay, so there's still uncertainty that might mean that the boundaries might be higher, but they could also be lower.
Exactly.
So we should not try to get as close to that and then stop, but stop at a lower level. What you talked about was also, when you introduced the planetary boundaries, about thresholds and about dangerous levels. What is the difference between these two?
Well, a threshold is more like a tipping point, is a set of conditions that the system reach at a certain time and space, and at that moment, a transformation takes place. The dangerous level represents more like a spatial region in which that threshold is located. So because, again, of the difficulty of dealing or establishing thresholds with large-scale processes, so I would prefer to talk more about dangerous level, which to me is a level within which I believe there is a threshold, because I think it's going to be, it's almost impossible, at least based on the current knowledge, to define where that threshold is.
Okay, so the dangerous level is less precise, but actually thresholds are
in statistical language,
hardly predictable.
It would be a lot more a threshold somewhere with confidence levels. So around it, so it's in more a level, a region.
Okay. Well, we don't have to deepen that, but there's one thing I would really like to know, and that is we were talking, or you were talking about global changes today, about global development. But actually, what you try to tell the students is about civic ecology. So how do we get from this global level back to the community level?
That's a very, very good question. Because, well, my assumption is the following. Why I talk today, the talk today was about global level processes, but this class is about local, regional approaches, about community-based activities or frameworks. Well, the way I think about the boundary, the planetary boundaries and the relationship of planetary boundaries with my activity in civic ecology is the following. First of all, I'm not very worried about those numbers, those boundaries, exactly the number. But I agree with them that given the accelerated rate of change on a global scale, we are in some way approaching dangerous, uncertain levels. That is, I don't know where it is exactly, but I'm concerned about getting too close to tipping points. This is one thing. The second thing, when I look at the 9 planetary boundaries, the scientists observed that 2 of them, climate change and ocean acidification, are large-scale processes. So I would say that civic ecology maybe has not much to do with those. However, there are 7 other planetary boundaries which are expressed in terms of planetary scale, but as opposed to the other 2, they are aggregates. So in other words, they result from degradation happening at the local and regional level. So I believe civic ecology then has a contribution to do, avoiding that those other 7 boundaries that are aggregate be transgressed. If we initiate, a community college program at a scale large enough, I mean, in many regions this process is taking place, that can make a difference. So we could guarantee that we would maintain the planet, humanity, in the safe zone, at least for 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. For the other 2, it's difficult. I think climate change, of course, is a very controversial issue. I think we are at past the tipping point. And even if we go now and come out as a planet, decide about reducing CO2 emissions, I think it's already too late. So the process, as I mentioned, the intensity frequency of extreme events like floods, wildfires, is already here with us. And to me, this is an indication that we already passed that tip, that threshold. And whatever we do now, is not going to solve this problem. We're going to have to live with this perhaps for the next 100 years. It's a little bit
take
late,
care that it's not getting worse.
Eh?
And try to make it not get worse.
That's true, but it's already a reality. Although the world is divided on this issue, I see countries that already accept the reality, and I think what they are trying to do is developing something that is one of aspects of civic ecology, to develop adaptive capacity, to develop alternatives that would allow them to cope with the changes that are coming. But unfortunately, other parts of the world, they are still discussing if this change is taking place. And I'm worried about them because I see part of the world preparing themselves to cope with the difficulties, and part of the world is still questioning if these changes are taking place.
Okay, but that is something that you will talk about in the upcoming lectures, won't you?
Yes, I hope that my intention here in these 2 lectures was first give you a general picture of what civic ecology is about. That's why I spent some time discussing the principles of civic ecology. And then I moved away to the planetary scale and tried to bring to our students a view of the state of the planet as well. And then in the next lecture, based on the question you asked me, what we operating civic ecology can do about. So we have now a picture of the planet, and the civic ecology that I'm proposing here, how civic ecology can be effective in helping humanity to cope with problems that are at the planetary scale.
So we now know that these global changes, global problems, don't only affect the global level of the planet, but also ourselves and the communities we live in. And so I hope the students will, in the next lecture, as I am, just wait for more information on the community level. So thank you, students, for listening, and thank you very much for the interview.
My pleasure.